For those who believe in God, no proof is necessary. For those who don't believe, no proof is possible. There's a video on this channel about my journey through Japan, a lifelong goal that I had set for myself and actually accomplished. The story was about what I did to get there, the trials and tribulations it took to go and live in another country. And for a long time, that was the most wonderful experience I had in my entire life. But in that video, there's a bookend about what came next. This is the story of how I rediscovered my faith and fell in love with the traditional Latin Mass. I grew up in the Midwest as a cradle Catholic. The area I was raised in had a heavily Irish population, and the big city by and large was one of the most Catholic places in America. It seemed there was a church on nearly every block. My Italian mother is Roman Catholic, and my father is Greek Orthodox, though non-practicing. In relationships of different faiths, parents ultimately have to make a decision on how the children are going to be raised. Considering the intra-Christian jump between a Catholic and an Orthodox is quite small compared to a Catholic and a non-denominational, my mother had us raised in the Catholic Church and up for Mass every Sunday at 7:30 a.m. It was often that both my parents were working to provide for the family, so when my siblings and I needed a babysitter, we were with my maternal grandfather and grandmother. They were like second parents to me. The bond we had shaped many of my happy moments from my childhood, and they were a great inspiration. My grandfather's tenacity was always something that never left me until this day, and my grandmother, on the other hand, was always a godly woman, someone who, in every moment, was the pinnacle of sweetness and love. It was through her that I learned about something called the Latin Mass, which, according to her, was much more reverent and solemn than the normal Mass. But as a wee lad, I had no idea what this meant. It was just something that stuck with me since I was a small child. Since my parents wanted the best for me and my siblings, they put us through the Catholic school that the local parish was attached to. It was a wonderful experience from what I remember. I went through all of my sacraments in that one church: baptism, reconciliation, first communion, and confirmation. And while they had priests and some nuns try to teach us about the importance of these spiritual events, admittedly, I never really understood the sacred meaning behind them. This extended to my high school, which was an all-boys Catholic school that touted the amount of students that were going to college. My parents saw this as the best path for me and my siblings, and career-wise, this is where a Christian brother opened my mind to the wonderful world of physics, which ultimately put me on the path to what some would consider being a successful mid-level engineer. However, this was a tremendous financial burden for my parents to do so, for not only me and my sibling. This would be worth it if the education that they gave us put us on a good path forward, which it undoubtedly did. Something I noticed in retrospect, though, was the significant lack of good catechesis that I had over 12 years of primary school education. For me, going to church was just a natural part of life. It's something that's done every weekend and hopefully gave me some good ways to live my life, to be a nice person. Throughout grade school, we were never challenged or even taught on what even being Catholic means and how it's unique in the world compared to other Christians, other than simple differences like sacraments or the rosary. Looking back on some of the topics that we were taught, it's just baffling. A good example is that in 6th grade, we had to learn about the Greek gods, and so they made us dress up as them to do a presentation on what they stood for. Mind you, this was outside of Halloween. It's very important to understand these figures, especially in the context of literature, whether you're reading Homer from the Greek perspective or Virgil from the Roman perspective. But I like to think back to Gustave Doré's painting of the triumph of Christ over paganism and realize that this Catholic educational institution had us dressing up as demons during our classes. Things didn't get much better in high school, as during freshman year we were taught about the Old Testament and the book of Leviticus from a teacher who was certainly light in the loafers. Sophomore year, learning about the New Testament from a football coach who didn't really care. And junior year, learning about morals. Now, fundamentally, I don't have a problem with the structure of this. However, the entire morals class was watching movies and talking about plot summaries instead of being taught what the Catholic Church believes. And this, in my opinion, was one of the most destructive things for many fallen away Catholics in their faith lives. And how much was tuition for that school again? Okay. As we read classic literature in honors and AP Lit classes, we never had the frame of reference to understand the morals from. nearly a decade after I graduated, I met up with the Christian brother who taught me physics to thank him for providing such a strong foundation in mathematics and science that gave me the ability to pivot jobs when I really needed to. There's more on why that's important a little later in the video, but I mentioned to him I literally knew nothing about my faith after 4 years of attending Catholic high school. To my dismay, he said that this was directed from the priest overseeing the school, which could be traced back to directives from the archdiocese. Now make of that what you will. I left for public university to study at an engineering school and focus on learning physics, which guided a large amount of the content that's put on this channel, to where I'm able to show you what I've learned in fun and interesting ways. In many engineering programs, there are people who are not particularly religious, but instead choose to worship a different god, science. I noticed this particularly with the shift in topics covered. The basic motto of Newtonian physics were developed by Isaac Newton. For every paper he wrote on calculus, there was one for his rather unorthodox religious beliefs. And this is how I know that science and religion are not totally opposed to each other. Georges Lemaitre, the Catholic cosmologist who posited the Big Bang theory, based his theory off the first few chapters of Genesis. And now we have ways to actually measure the effects of cosmic background radiation. College was tough for me, considering I worked tirelessly to achieve my master's in nuclear engineering. But despite the constant nights where I would fuel my body on greasy gyros and milkshakes as I was writing a thesis, there was still something I did every single weekend, and that was go to Mass at the Newman Center. I don't recall ever missing a week, even though for a long time I was dating a Protestant girl and would end up going to her church on Sunday. I'd still go to Mass on Saturday or Sunday evening. There was something ingrained into me that even though I was in a godless place, my faith never left me. Compare that to my siblings who, throughout their college experience at a private Christian school, stopped going to Mass. I still pray for their reversions to this day. Fast forward to the trip I mentioned at the start of the video, Japan. I lived in Japan for a few months while working as an engineer in the semiconductor industry, and I could honestly talk about that for hours on how it was such an amazing experience. But I didn't realize that this was the most pivotal moment in my entire faith journey. For the very first time in my life, I was not attending Mass on the weekends. This is primarily because the Christian community in Japan is quite small, after being suppressed for hundreds of years. Regions like Kyushu in the south are hubs of Catholicism because historically, that's where the ports were where missionaries came. Though places in the north, like Sendai, where I was living, have a history tied to Pope Pius V, who helped fund the daimyo Date Masamune's conquest of the region. But even with those historical reference points, the nearest church was 50 minutes away by car, and I didn't have an international license to use during my time there. I relied solely on public transit, and to get to the nearest Catholic church was virtually impossible, as it would have taken hours just to go one way. Now, I'd brought my Bible with me while I was traveling, but when I tried to read it on the weekends, my thoughts were muddled, confused, and I couldn't focus on the Word of God the way I normally would at Mass. While some people might think I'm falling into the stereotype of Catholics who don't read their Bible, this was more accurately my dyslexia taking a real toll on myself, as I had virtually stopped reading all but comic books and scientific papers since the early days of college. Narrative structures, illusions, metaphors, parables. I didn't understand these things, and without a guide to help me see the context in which the divinely inspired scriptures were written, I was lost. So I'm stuck in a foreign country, conversing with the Japanese fairly casually, and I'm asked multiple times if I was a Christian because I'm from America. And while I specify that I'm Catholic, I'm unable to really explain to people what I believe in and why I'm a Catholic. There were certain cultural aspects I could lean into, like, for example, the Pope being the spiritual head as one of them. But I found myself questioning for the first time, why do I believe what I believe? I've been traveling through all these Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, yet something felt a little hollow. As I observed their worship, I was perplexed by the orientation of it. I didn't feel at peace while I was there. And this was my first step down the rabbit hole of rediscovering my faith. When I had returned from Japan, I was living in the mountain regions of America, busy at work, bringing the technology I'd learned from Japan to the States for development. And during this time, I thought the best place to go would be the local cathedral, where I could talk to some of the Polish priests on what I was feeling, and if there were any way to get involved with the community to learn more about Catholicism. He immediately recommended two things: going back to confession for the first time in roughly 10 years, and talking with members of the Knights of Columbus. Let's start with confession. The sacrament of reconciliation. I had never considered going since probably freshman year of high school because I just assumed I could go to God directly. Middlemen are often inefficient, said my engineer brain. It was something that was never particularly mentioned or important to my family, at least not that I remember. But it was after talking to this priest that he gave me the assurance my sins would be forgiven if I were truly contrite. And after about 10 years of not going, there were certainly some areas of improvement that needed to be made. The single act of partaking in the sacrament of reconciliation became one of the best ways I could receive peace of mind in my life. My brain likes being able to tell someone something from behind a screen, getting everything off my chest, and potentially never seeing that person again. I have a preference for confession in that traditional way, in a confessional, where the figure of the priest is completely obscured or shrouded. It really helps with his role in persona Christi. The assurance that not only your sins are being forgiven, but the seal of confession is binding with the priest are some of the most valuable aspects of the sacrament. By making an effort to go to confession more often, this helped me realize I shouldn't be receiving communion, the Holy Eucharist, Christ's precious body, blood, soul, and divinity, while not in a state of grace. One might assume this would be baseline knowledge for anyone who went to Catholic school, but hey, here we are. Looking back on it, there were many abuses of the Eucharist that had took place at my local parish and high school. For example, students who were in peer ministry during their senior year worked as Eucharistic ministers for the entire high school during Mass, and they would casually fling the host or drop it. Even though I was part of that class, I never administered communion myself because I never really felt it was my place to do that. Something about it made me think my hands were never clean enough. I could have never articulated the reason back then, but it was just an inherent feeling. My respect and adoration for the Eucharist increased exponentially as I was looking at Christ in a way that I really hadn't since I was a kid. Next is the Knights of Columbus. They are a fraternal organization of Catholic brothers that spawned from Blessed Michael McGivney in response to the spread of Freemasonry in the late 1800s. I have somewhat of a debt that I owe them. If you're a fan of this channel, you'll know that I'm a pianist, and the only scholarship I received for high school was from the Knights of Columbus for helping play piano at the church in 8th grade. I have a distinct memory of them walking into the church in their outlandish hats with swords on the side. Back then, I thought I wanted to be one of them. I would later find out as I started exploring their ministry that they did very targeted work to support veterans and single mothers, hosting VA events and funding crisis pregnancy centers. I was elevated to the 4th degree within a matter of months and received all the accolades that came with that. Yes, including the cool sword. Unfortunately, the modern knights have a more streamlined uniform that looks like a modern military to attract more young men, so I won't have the pleasure of wearing that funny hat anytime soon. After I was initiated, I learned from my grandfather that his dad, who had died while my grandfather was quite young, was a member of the Knights, and they were present at his funeral. I knew this made my grandfather extremely happy, and I was ecstatic to find a way to help to serve the local community. One thing I was adamant about establishing was a scholarship fund for people who were musically inclined to go to Catholic high school. Since I understood how much of a burden the cost of tuition could be at those schools, especially from my own family situation, this was some way I wanted to help. The first $1,000 check came straight out of my pocket to establish the creation of such a fund, before I passed it on to the rest of the Knights, where local parishioners could donate, and then have the children who would be up for the scholarship write one-page papers on how music inspired their life. The Knights would then look over those papers, then choose a winner and deliver the scholarship to that student, and begin collecting for the next year. And to my knowledge, this opportunity is still going at that assembly. It's crazy how small acts of kindness can help inspire a person to continue the cycle of charity. This inspired me to attend Mass more often, as I would skip my lunch break at work to drive to the church for daily Mass at noon. Around this time, a new priest was just ordained, and his revelations about Scripture were entirely fascinating. He was a Baptist convert, which gave him a very compelling perspective and really fueled my desire to be engaged with the readings each and every day. My faith was being formed in part by the people I was surrounded by, coworkers and friends who were Catholic, all willing and ready to talk to me about it. There's also a special place in my heart for a few influencers that assisted me in this rediscovery of faith. If you're Catholic, I'm sure you would recognize a few of these guys. They're all really great, even if you don't agree with every single opinion from them and how they present arguments. They gave me a baseline to go and dig a little deeper. And this led to me reading about the lives of the saints and adding bits and pieces of how they understood the faith into my own life. When you have a relatively well-documented history of an institution, say about 2,000 years, you quickly learn that every question you've ever had has already been asked and answered by someone else. I love doing research for fun, as it is part of my job and identity as an engineer. The documented legacy of the church presents a pile of evidence for the historical and spiritual weight of the Christian faith, but in particular the Catholic persuasion. The Church Fathers and ecumenical councils are a great reference for learning about the history of Christianity through the world. And this was very important for understanding things like Marian apparitions, the Crusades, and how the Catholic Church is the bedrock for Western civilization. If I had to pick one specific piece of literature that shaped my perspective, though, it would be Dante's Divine Comedy. Mind you, this was before I had even read the Bible or Catechism of the Catholic Church from cover to cover. I found the most wonderful cloth-bound Penguin classic book, and I knew I just had to read it. This very poem was referenced time and time again by some of the priests I was talking to, some of the influencers I was listening to, and it was instrumental in me understanding my faith. Dante's Commedia radically reshaped my perspective on life, the primal cause, and love. So I cannot recommend it enough to anyone who is interested. And my analytical mind was keen on reading the in-book commentaries and watching different videos dissecting each canto. Yet after a read-through, I feel like I've still barely scratched the surface. This poem reignited my desire to begin reading again, after years of being functionally illiterate. Dante was a good linchpin for the classics that came before him, and the classics that would come after. After finishing Dante, I found a book club that would help me get through my dyslexia as I went back to Homer's Iliad and the Tales of Gilgamesh to start from the beginning of literature and make my way through the ages. And as I read, I would constantly find authors of the books I read shaped by crucial figures in the church, like Augustine and Aquinas. I was learning about the importance of the church in the world, however, I wanted to know the meaning of the Mass more. Now that I had been going more than ever, how each prayer and action played into the sacrifice. And one thing in my research consistently kept coming up time and time again: the Tridentine Mass. Now, it wasn't a shock to me that there were different versions of the Mass. My father's side of the family is Greek Orthodox, so I had been to those liturgies before. I thought it was just a different form of what I had known as the Mass. You have a priest, you have the Eucharist, and that's all you need. Having grown up in the culture of Vatican II, where over the past 50 years there's been a precipitous decline in church attendance, I didn't think much of it. But certain things about the ordinary Mass were never explained to me. Why is it preferred that the Kyrie is in Greek and the Agnus Dei is in Latin? And this use of the language Latin was proliferating everywhere, from the most intellectual Catholic apologists or commentators I was listening to. One could say that I had made an intellectual reversion back to the church before making a reversion of heart. Throughout all of this, one thing from my childhood was ringing stronger than ever, and that was the words of my grandmother about the Latin Mass. At the time, I was in a diocese where the Latin Mass was heavily restricted. This was a feature of Pope Francis's pontificate that some view in a more negative light, but I really view it quite positively. Like a child, when you're told not to do something, you kind of want to do it. That's why our concupiscence leads us to sin, and curiosity is not a virtue. But I am a naturally curious person, and seeing how the Latin Mass was so viciously restricted did pique my curiosity to figure out more about it, and why was there such a visceral reaction from people who go to the new Mass. Where I lived, it was scheduled that the second Sunday of every month was dedicated to the Latin Mass, and one would have to drive 50 minutes away from the city center at 2 p.m. in the afternoon to a very small church with no heating or air conditioning. And I absolutely hated the experience of going. I believe the bishop knew exactly what he was doing to discourage people from attending that Mass. The day I went, it was over 110 degrees in that church. I had no missal. I didn't understand anything that was going on. I could barely hear the priest or Gregorian chant because a family with 7 under 7 was basically letting their kids run around and scream a bunch and didn't do anything about it. Millennial parenting, am I right? I didn't think there was anything wrong with the priest, I just didn't think it was for me. So I decided to go back to the Novus Ordo time and time again, where I felt comfortable and welcome. But several months later, and a watch-through of the Mass of the Ages, I find myself purchasing a Roman Missal and deciding to give the TLM another try. I don't want to open any cans of theological worms when I mention the SSPX, but I just want to relay my experience of going to an SSPX parish for the first time. Designated TLM. I decided to use a basic TLM finder online to find a different parish 50 minutes in the other direction at a very small chapel. This time I was more prepared, I felt like I was really ready and willing to get deeper into it. And then the moment I got there, I was checked by armed guards who didn't recognize me. Okay, that's a little strange, and when I entered the parish, everyone's praying the rosaries in Latin, and the Mass started, and even though I really didn't know what I was doing or couldn't read the missal or find my way around it. I just decided to be there and be present and listen. And quite honestly, that type of advice isn't super helpful. Listening to the music is totally beautiful, but for me, when I don't have a sense of what's going on, it can be quite challenging to resonate with that. Needless to say, after the stricter greeting than TSA, I wasn't feeling too hot about this experience either. So I decided to stay after the church and ask a few people why they liked the Latin Mass. To me, there was nothing about this Mass compared to the designated Latin Mass I went to that was any different. And after talking to some parishioners, I ended up leaving that chapel with a stack of books on why the SSPX was valid and legitimate, and a whole bunch of other things that I really didn't read. However, I did watch the documentary on Archbishop Lefebvre, make of that what you will. I was really, really disappointed and returned to the normal Mass. I'd gone through almost an entire liturgical year of daily Masses at this point, but was craving more. While I loved this parish, the new head pastor certainly took a lot of liberties in his sermons and how the Mass was conducted. Lots of jokes, mingling with the congregation during the homily, and the choice to move away from an organ towards guitar music interrupted the focus on the Eucharist. Meanwhile, in my personal life, I'd been away from home for a long time, was overworked at an engineering role I was in, and personal struggles with past and present demons brought me to confession more and more often. This would all come to a head by the end of the year. Christmas break of 2023. I was planning on taking an extended Christmas break with my family during this time, and it felt like the Holy Spirit picked me up and put me at that specific place at that specific time. There are reasons in and of itself why I needed to return home at this time, decisions I made that compelled my family to want me to return. Those details are personal and I do not feel like sharing them. All I know is that during that time, the only person I wanted to talk to was my grandfather, because I wanted to be like him and felt like I was failing to live up to the very many blessings that I had in my life because of him, due to these personal struggles. After my grandmother had passed, he moved in with my mom, dad, and sister for the past few years. The second night I was home, I sat down with him to have a long talk over dinner, and I remember him saying that he was glad that I finally came back. And while I returned on somewhat sudden circumstances, the next day I found out I wouldn't be going anywhere for a long time. It was 12:20 p.m. on December 19th, and my entire life changed forever when someone decided to run a two-way stop sign on a 55-mile-per-hour road. What should have been an afternoon of shopping for Christmas presents turned into the most terrible day of my life. There were 4 passengers in the car. I was the driver. My grandfather was in the passenger seat. My mother was behind me and my sister behind him. The collision hit the driver's side, and for all intent and purpose, I should have been killed on impact. That I shouldn't be here right now. But for reasons that are beyond my comprehension, I have a purpose left. I walked away from the crash with a torn rotator cuff, concussion, and gash in the back of my head. My sister was also relatively fine, but can't say the same for the other passengers. The oncoming vehicle spun 90 degrees and hit my mother directly, shattering her pelvis and dislocating both her hips. My grandfather sustained injuries so great that it was too much for his frail 90-year-old body to handle. The last thing I remember him saying to me as I pulled him out of the wreckage that day was that was a lot, but it takes a lot more than that to kill an Italian. Both were helivac to the regional hospital, and for 6 days my grandfather fought in intensive care. On Christmas Eve, I held his hand for the longest time I can't remember, and gave him my rosary. A rosary that my grandmother had given me before she had passed. I lost my grandfather on Christmas. My mother was fortunate to be in surgery immediately, and from what I could tell, the procedure went better than expected. However, it was unclear on how she would heal, and if she'd even walk again. With how everything in my life changed in an instant, I decided to leave my job and focus on helping my family, and start giving everything up to the Lord, for He had saved me that day. I needed to be with my family, and He made this decision for me. And so, I moved into my parents' house. I took a few months off while my mom was in the hospital and assisted living and rehab, that time in a wheelchair. Meanwhile, I myself went through weeks of rehab and the recommended therapy. It was January of 2024, and the road to healing began at one small parish on the north side of the downtown area in a totally new state. My parents' house is quite far from the nearest TLM parish, but I found one on the tracker that showed up for a Sunday low mass. When I got there, to my surprise, the church was closed, and the mass was being held in a parish hall across the street on the second floor, quite literally the upper room. I decided to drive an hour and a half to go to the Tridentine Mass. I did this for twofold reasons. One, it was a brief escape from how everything in my life was crumbling around me. And two, it was what God was calling me to do. Having just lost my grandfather, I decided to take my grandmother's words to heart and listen to her, and be close to both of them at that Mass. While I began attending Mass daily at my parents' local parish, everyone knew my mother and grandfather. They knew the situation. It felt like a tension of the crash was being held over me. Despite this, I took every moment I could to feel closer to Christ. It was a radical transformation in how I viewed life and family. But something about the first Latin Mass that I went to totally changed my perspective. With all the pressure of everything that happened bearing down on me, at that place, I felt the least stressed in the entire world. That specific parish, that specific Latin Mass. That's not to say I didn't feel any pain at all, but even at the Novus Ordo, I was still being brought back into this world of despair. Every time I was distracted from the sacrifice of the Mass, that despair would creep in around the edges. And I'd like to take a moment to think about why that is. The Tridentine Mass in particular is completely otherworldly. I noticed immediately that every sense of my body was stimulated and oriented towards the proper cause. The use of incense and beautiful Gregorian chant showed me clearly why the Eucharist is so beautiful. And on top of this was in a very basic room with a small altar and folding chairs instead of pews. While similar to the Masses I was used to, it brought focus to the Blessed Sacrament that I had never seen before. And it gave me something to believe in, something to fight for, and something to hope for. The Latin Mass spoke to me and clicked all of a sudden. The foreign language didn't even seem unfamiliar to me, as it might for other people. This is because it's easy for me to see patterns, being an engineer, so the Latin roots of words were always something I had seen in dinosaur names and anatomy. So I was inspired to learn languages using the Latin I started hearing at Mass. This language is the key aspect that adds another layer to the mystery of faith. Other forms of Protestant or evangelical worship are very direct and clear about their messages, but that's not the Mass. Shallow water is clear compared to a deep, murky ocean, and we have a deep ocean of experience, especially with this particular form of Mass, which has existed in some close approximation thereof for nearly 1,200 years. There's so many little details that all came together for a bigger picture of what the Mass truly is. Ad orientem, or facing east towards the altar, in the words of Pope Benedict XVI when he was a cardinal, means going to meet the coming Christ. The liturgy turned towards the east affects entry, so to speak, into the procession of history towards the future, the new heaven and the new earth which we encounter in Christ. The priest is leading the parish in prayer. We're all facing the same direction, the same goal. Many of the priest's prayers are often not audible for enough of the people in the back of the church. This is simply because when you're praying, you're typically not shouting or projecting, unless it's done through song. And this is why music plays a key role. While the offertory begins, the choir becomes one of the most beautiful sources of sound I have ever been around. For me, reverence is the defining quality that I strive to see in a Mass. And the reason reverence is so important is most clearly explained in a quote from Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. The daily sacrifice, more awfully really than the sacrifices of the antique world, stirred him as much by its superb rejection of the evidence of the senses, as by the primitive simplicity of its elements, and the eternal pathos of the human tragedy that it sought to symbolize. This quote is even more interesting in the context of Oscar Wilde's life, a debauch escapade through fame and failure, culminating in him meeting Pope Leo XIII, and his blessing to receive extreme unction, or prior to death conversion, into the Roman Catholic Church. I've attended and continue to attend some Novus Ordo Masses that are extremely reverent. I would not say I'm a TLM exclusivist by any stretch of the imagination, even after attending there for almost 2 years. In my opinion, it's the most beautiful form of expression of the Mass, especially because it inspired most of the great saints we seek intercession from. For example, to sit down and realize you're hearing and experiencing nearly the same form of worship that St. Thomas Aquinas did 800 years ago is something very special. We shouldn't have to get excited about a Mass being reverent. All Masses should be reverent, but unfortunately, some are not. Christ is on the altar, and you should want not only for yourself, but the people who surround you to give him the worship he deserves. This is why Mass, for hundreds of years, was unshakable, eternal, and ever new. Going to the TLM felt like coming home, that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and all the healing I was going through was more efficacious than any secular recommendation like going to therapy. This revolutionized my prayer life and routines, daily rosaries and novenas, morning prayer, evening prayer, and all of the above. Blessings before meals, things I just wasn't doing before that I started doing on a daily basis. It's because I'd been introduced to a community that expected me to do that in some way. My health, both physical and mental, improved dramatically in ways that secularists may not be able to understand. And I think the cultural shift is helping even more, as we're seeing for the first time young men return to the church in greater numbers than young women. And we have an American Pope, Leo XIV, which is something nobody expected to see, and he has been conducting himself in what is an openly more traditional and reverent way for the office. I also met him, so there's that. He is absolutely wonderful. After over a year of attending this parish, the main church finally reopened, and it is by far the most beautiful church in the state, possibly one of the most beautiful churches in all of the United States. Having recently traveled to Rome, there's a different level of historical devotion to Catholicism there compared to the US, but we can't compete since we haven't been around long enough. It is worth saying that seeing the reconstruction of this 150-plus-year-old church proved to me that we have the ability to build beautiful things. In modernity, we choose not to. We make all of those tall and skinny, ugly buildings that look like blocks and that are totally utilitarian. As you've seen in some of my previous videos, I've taken a strong position against modernity because it makes everything ugly, and it doesn't have to be like that. The moment I stepped into my church after it was reconstructed, I knew I would be married there one day. That's the type of beauty that our society is missing, but more and more recently, we're taking it back, little by little. After a long time of making videos, I was really contemplating the purpose of this channel. I don't intend to make totally religious content, or making this a ministry. I just want to be totally independent from chasing trends in the algorithm for getting clicks. And hopefully I can make content that enlightens people's minds and brings a smile to their face by the end of it. At the end of the day, I realized through the discovery of the traditional Latin Mass, Christ comes first. That means when I have the chance to worship Christ at Mass, even if it's a daily Mass, I will prioritize that over making YouTube videos. That's just the way it's gonna be, because the algorithm won't care when I'm gone and dead. I don't even think it cares about me now, so why worry about it? I've had a second lease on life, and I have a choice to spend it praising God, or, as I was before on my channel, making content that I had waning passions about. This has ultimately been rewarding in my own life, as I've purchased a home 30 years earlier than the median homeowner age in America, and I've had awesome opportunities at my current job, to where I've met the president and CFO of massive companies you've definitely heard of. I think that's really impressive as a mid-level engineer. Job opportunity came at the best time for me. It came the day that my FMLA, or family medical leave, expired from my previous job. God has a plan for me, and he's provided at every moment that I've needed him. None of this could have been done without God, and I'd especially like to point out the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary in all of these blessings in my life. But the culture is changing. I see at my parish the median age is somewhere in the mid-20s. This is a welcome step because I've gotten to meet a bunch of people who are feeling a similar longing in their lives for a myriad of reasons. But for 90% of people attending the Latin Mass, it seems like they've sought it out specifically. They're curious, they're ambitious, and it's wonderful. There's a strong group of especially young men coming together to not fall into the nihilistic cynicism of the modern world. The TLM is a place where people can do that, and I am incredibly optimistic about the future of the TLM in America and the rest of the world. I can only speak for myself, but it has brought me closer to God in ways I didn't think were possible. I sometimes wish it could have been here sooner, but everything happens on God's providence and God's time. The challenges I've needed to overcome, the battles I've needed to fight, and the relationships I've meant to have or not have. The TLM has been instrumental in helping me overcome a lot of the demons that I've had in my life and the struggles that I face. If there's one thing you should take away from this video, it's that everyone's faith is a journey, and their faith journey is different. I would like it that everyone who watches this video at least go and try the traditional Latin Mass just once, even if they're not Catholic. I even have some coworkers and people at the book club that I go to who are interested in doing that. I wouldn't be here today without God, and I want to give him the glory and reverence he deserves when I worship him. And I have to thank both of my grandparents who put me on this path to loving him in a way I couldn't imagine up to this point. If you need any recommendations, feel free to reach out in the comments or DM me on X. I know I struggled with it personally, but by God's grace and love, I was able to fall in love with the TLM, and maybe you can too. God bless. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.